So today's lecture is military intervention to facilitate secession. And I'm going to go through at least two examples, which is Kosovo and northern Cyprus. I might also include South Ossetia, depending on time. The lecture will be about 45 minutes and then we'll be asking questions, but you are welcome to ask questions as we go along. The title is difficult. We're going to explain the title, well, I'm going to explain the title for the first 10-15 minutes, and then I'm going to go through the examples. So I want you to be clear on what the title means before we start. Okay? My interest in northern Cyprus is quite deep. I lived in this country for 7 years. I speak the language and I've researched it quite a lot. So that's where this whole thing comes from. So I'll go through Kosovo as it's probably the most familiar to you. I think most of you will remember the wars in former Yugoslavia. If you follow the news at that time, you will remember it. And then northern Cyprus is a lesser known example, but it's one that's very familiar to me. Secession is what all of these examples hinge on. This is the important word. This definition comes from Viva Onobarkis. She was not only the lead academic on secession, she was also at one time the only academic on secession. This book, The Dynamics of Secession, is not only the most important book, it is the only one. So her definition here is the important one. I won't read it out. You can read it here, you can read it on your slides. But secession is where you have one country made up of many regions, and one of those regions wants to leave. So you're all here studying in the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom is made up of England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. In September, Scotland will have a referendum. Everybody in the country will vote on whether they want to stay in the United Kingdom or leave. If Scotland leaves, then that is secession. Are there any other examples that you can think of secession? South Sudan is one very successful example. It has broken away, it's been recognised by the UN, it's been admitted as a member. Are there any other issues that are going on around secession at the moment? In Ukraine and Iraq. Kurdistan has been referred to. So these are the examples we have of secession that are current at the moment. Okay? If you have any questions around this word, ask them now. We'll hear about secession for the next 40 minutes. But if we're okay, we'll move on. The next one is facilitate. I'm talking about big powers facilitating secession. Facilitate is like helping. But I've not used the word help. If I say, this thing here, I want to reach it, can you help me reach it? Then maybe, if you're taller, you'll come along and you'll get it for me. If I say, can you facilitate me getting this, then maybe you'll get a chair for me and I can stand on the chair and I can take it down myself. So I will be the one doing the action. So to facilitate someone means that they are still doing it themselves, you're just helping them. And that's very important. With secession, there's often been a criticism of countries breaking away. People have said that these are puppet states. They're not real countries. Somebody else is controlling them. I've chosen these examples because in these examples, the people are definitely choosing themselves to secede. They have been helped, but the agency, the action, is with the people seceding. Most of you will understand this word, war. But the meaning of the word war has changed over time. So I've started out with a quote, politics by other means. Have you come across this quote before? No? This came from Karl von Clausewitz, who was a Prussian military officer in the Napoleonic Wars. So 200 years ago he wrote a book called On War, and he described war as just politics by other means. It starts with politics, it ends with politics, there's politics going between. He said that war was just one policy of the state, an irrational policy. You could choose to do one thing as a government, you could choose to do another. War was rational. But this term, the scourge of war, the disease of war, comes from the first page of the United Nations Charter. This is a very different idea. They are saying that war is a disease. It's not a rational choice. It's not something you can sensibly do. It's a disease which is plaguing humanity. The change was in the change of destructiveness of war. 200 years ago, the destruction of war was fairly limited. But from sort of 1918 to 1945, we had a revolution in warfare whereby it became far, far, far more destructive. So it began to be viewed as a disease in itself. And so we had the delegitimization of war. It's no longer seen as rational. It's no longer seen as a legitimate thing for governments to do. I quoted a man called Smith here, who was a former British Army general, who said that war is not seen as legitimate. And that most wars are about people trying to make themselves seem more legitimate than the other side. So this held from 1945 until the early 90s, the idea that war is just a disease. But from the early 90s developing through the late 90s, we have the responsibility to protect. It's known for short as R2P. Responsibility to protect came out of the genocide in Rwanda. Again, have you heard of Rwanda?
Yeah.
You're aware of what's happened there?
Yeah.
So countries could have intervened. They chose not to intervene. They said intervening would be a war. War is a disease. We will not do that. And as a result, over 1 million people died. So this brought about the idea that maybe there are some cases where a war would be a rational choice, where intervening would be a rational choice. But it didn't change the fact that war is seen as a dirty word. We have here a list of words that we use for war without saying war. So we can describe war sometimes as peace enforcement. We can describe them as counterinsurgency operations. We can call them task force deployments. And this is the professional language used to describe warfare. Okay? The reason this becomes complicated is because of these two words. Both of these words are on the first page of the UN Charter. Both of them are given equal importance. Sovereignty. The idea that countries have non-interference, that they're all equal, that there's no right for one country to dictate to others. The other is self-determination, the right of people to determine their own destiny. Self-determination means that the Iraqi people can do what the Iraqi people want, that the British people can do what the British people want. But there's a couple of problems with these two terms. The right of a people. In the UN Charter, there is no definition of a people. So Sudan was a good example where we would say the Sudanese are a people. But people in South Sudan would say, no, the South Sudanese are a people, the North Sudanese are a people, we're two separate peoples. But we recognize Sudan. So therefore, we recognize the idea that all the Sudanese were one people. So this word has become incredibly difficult as time has progressed. In the UK, we don't seem to have a problem with Scotland having independence. The British people have debated this, we leave it to the Scots, and there doesn't seem to be a big feeling about it. In most parts of the world, there is a feeling about countries being broken up. In the examples I'll go into, there were very strong feelings about countries being broken up. What we're talking about here is sovereignty, that a country that exists is like a person. It can't be split up. It can't be broken down. It can't be interfered with legally. But we have this as well, self-determination, that people can do what they want. Okay? And we'll talk through the examples. It might make more sense with examples. So again, back to the title, Military Intervention to Facilitate Secession. We have wars to help people get independence. And that's a simple way of saying it. Wars to help people get independence. So we can start out with Kosovo. Here you can see in the orange, Serbia. You can see in the red, Kosovo. And before 1990, these were one country. And we can see here the complex of countries that used to be, formerly, Yugoslavia. I asked, did you remember Yugoslavia? Most of you kind of, I don't need to go into that. I won't bore you with the details. You might have noticed on the slides, I've given you a very nice picture of Kosovo. Normally, when you study war and conflict, you see sort of soldiers fighting, people being angry, you see broken houses. I often think that the day-to-day picture is kind of a more accurate picture. This is the country that people are fighting for. And this is the country that people live in. I feel that just seeing it can sometimes make it a bit more real. I'm going to talk about three groups of people, each of which are kind of complicated in themselves. The Kosovars. Kosovars are the people of Kosovo, a 13th century state that was absorbed into the Turkish Empire, been absorbed into the Serbian Empire, it was absorbed into Yugoslavia, but it's always remained something of its own sort of nation. They were part of Serbia, Serbia was part of Yugoslavia. Serbia broke away from Yugoslavia, but Serbia did not want Kosovo to break away from Serbia. They wanted independence to kind of stop with Serbia. And the intervention, we're talking about the North Atlantic Treaty Alliance, NATO. You'll have heard of this organisation. Kosovo was the first aggressive war fought by NATO in its history. For 50 years, it had existed as a military alliance for defence only. This marked a change from purely defensive to offensive strategy. The conflict in Kosovo had been relatively small. Throughout the history of Yugoslavia, it was a small, small part of it. Throughout the breakup of Yugoslavia, Kosovo was not seen as a serious issue. So when there was the peace negotiation, the Dayton Accords in 1995, as Yugoslavia was breaking up, the Kosovars were not invited. They were not invited because it was not seen as serious. It was also seen as including one too many parties. If you included the Kosovars, you'd start to have to include maybe the Greeks, maybe the Turks, maybe more people around the area. So they were not included in the Dayton Accords. But there was a small issue there. The small issue is that the Kosovars had governed themselves. They did run local government until 1988. In 1988, the Kosovar government was cancelled, it was removed. Their powers were stripped by the central government in Serbia. When this happened, people went on strike, people had hunger strikes, there were protests, but they were peaceful for the most part. So in 1988 we have a series of peaceful protests around Kosovar's right to self-determination. What happened in 1995, and this is according to the American scholar Noam Chomsky, when they were left out of these negotiations, it caused a change, that people started to look to the more violent methods. People started to say, well, if we can't get what we want by peaceful methods, if the whole world ignores us using peaceful methods, maybe we should start using more violent methods. There is another thing that was going on at the same time, which is that the government of Serbia was becoming increasingly repressive towards its own people. They had a lot of pressures on them. They had economic pressures, political pressures, and they started to be increasingly brutal towards their own people. The Serbian government was brutal to the Serbs. They were also brutal to the Kosovars. So the change in the Kosovar leadership, from the peaceful leadership to the more violent leadership, was partly that they were being ignored, and partly because they were being oppressed anyway. They were being killed in increasing numbers. They started to be killed in such numbers that the world took notice. The conflict, which from 1995 was not relevant to any peace negotiations, was relevant by 1999. By 1999, this was something the whole world was looking at. So this is what I'm talking about. The small conflict suddenly escalated. It went from very, very small, to something that nobody had heard of, to something that everybody heard of. The outside intervention was the NATO bombing campaign of Serbia, which you could have watched on TV. It was quite memorable. This led, in large part, to the independence of Kosovo. Kosovo governs itself now, thanks to the outside intervention. But it isn't recognised by every state in the world. There are 193 member states of the United Nations. Only 108 actually recognise Kosovo today. And that doesn't even include everyone in the European Union. So there are countries in the European Union, Greece and South Cyprus, which do not recognise Kosovo as a legitimate country. They say, no, it should be part of Serbia. So you have European Union countries, I believe North Sudan and Georgia, say that no, Kosovo is not a country, it's part of Serbia. So they do not recognise that it's self-governing. Okay? The reason they don't recognise it is due to this dilemma here. Serbia holds state-to-state recognition because of sovereignty. countries say we recognise Serbia as a sovereign country, and it remains sovereign. Other people say, well, Kosovo had a referendum. The people of Kosovo voted to become independent. This is sometimes described as vertical sovereignty and horizontal sovereignty, or vertical legitimacy, horizontal legitimacy. What that means, going horizontally, one country recognises another country, one government recognises another government. If you believe government-to-government relationships are important, then Serbia is the right country, and Kosovo is not. If you believe that people movements are more important, that the grassroots movements, that the ordinary people should be allowed to decide, and this is called vertical, because the government draws its power from the people. If you believe governments draw their power from the people, then the Kosovan referendum is important, and that takes priority. I've got another point here, which is that the United Nations mission in Kosovo, UNMIK, lasted 9 years, and the staff still remain. So it's been 15 years since the war, which was only 78 days, but it led to a 15-year deployment of resources. So what I'm saying here is that military force did not resolve the political issue. Before we thought, well, which is legitimate, Serbia or Kosovo? Are they both legitimate? Is one part of another? We're still asking the same questions now. What I would suggest is that before 1999, the Serbs had the ability to send tanks, to send troops into Kosovo. The Serbs were burning Kosovan homes. Now they can't do that. So lives have certainly been safeguarded by this, but it hasn't addressed the political issue. Are there any of you who would like to ask questions at this point? You're looking quite concerned. Any questions? Okay. No.
Why is the big countries try to facilitate other countries?
There are a number of reasons why. In the case of Kosovo, one reason might be that the people in the United Kingdom, the people in the United States, saw what was happening. They saw the Serbs sending tanks into villages. They saw them burning villages, killing men, women and children, and said, this can't happen. It's happened in Rwanda, we don't want it to happen again. Well, yes, the politicians could be reacting to the pressure of British people saying to the British government, this is wrong. And the American president responding to the American people saying, this is wrong. They need to be re-elected. There is another issue, which is more internal, whereby Tony Blair was the leader of the United Kingdom at this time. He had been elected on domestic policy only. He didn't get elected saying, I intend to make Britain a power on the world stage. He was only elected saying, I intend to improve British public services. But trying to improve British public services is very much a financial issue. You have to pay for it. The ability to pay for it rested with his Chancellor, Gordon Brown. So his Chancellor, Gordon Brown, restricted certain areas of movement, largely through his prudent financial management. But defence and international policy is the Prime Minister's own area. The Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister can make this to a certain extent without the Chancellor. So there are some people who would say that Tony Blair was under a pressure to do something as a leader, and this was something on which he could do something as a leader without Gordon Brown. Within the United States, the leader was Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton was under pressure from Bob Dole. Bob Dole was his opponent at the time, who was thought to be much stronger on defence. So if Bill Clinton was weak on Kosovo, if Bill Clinton allowed things to happen the American public didn't like, then people would say, Bill Clinton is weak on this, Bob Dole is strong on this. It would attract support for Bob Dole away from Bill Clinton. So there is the internal reason why Britain intervened and why the United States intervened. There is also the response to what was happening in Kosovo. So it's a mixture of different issues.
Sorry, do you mean that it's illegal? It's legal way to collect some foreign troops and intervene in other countries in order to solve some struggles inside this country?
the basis for legality would be in United Nations security resolutions. And there were a series of United Nations security resolutions allowing international powers to act within any means necessary, and that normally does mean military action. But the exact legality, to be honest, is always debated. The United Nations does not exist to allow wars and to say, you can have a war. The United Nations says, war is a disease, we must stop it. But occasionally there are resolutions that say, any means necessary, and these have been passed for Kosovo. Okay.
So, as you mentioned, there is no definition of the people in the United Nations.
That's right.
Yes. But all countries have the minority people or the another ethnic groups in the country. And so, if we allow them to independent from the central government, it happens like the millions or thousands of millions of countries exist.
Yeah.
But how can we decide this is the correct or legal right to independence, or just only some kind of inside conflict?
The answer, the very honest answer, is nobody knows, and nobody has an idea. We started out with maybe 20 countries at the beginning of the 20th century, and we've ended up with 193 plus others that are not recognized. So the simple answer is, we're not sure. How far does this go? So the Serbians would say, well, it stops here. It stops with us, and Kosovo is one country too many. The Cypriots would say, it stops with us, and Turkish Cyprus, that's too many. And the Georgians would say, Georgia getting independence is okay, but when you get South Ossetia, that's really too far. So we are talking about where you draw the line. How far does it go? And the answer is, we don't know. Okay. This is the country I lived in for 7 years. If you have any questions on this, I'm pretty sure I'll be able to answer it. We have Turkish Cyprus here. We have Greek Cyprus here. We have the United Nations going across here. This is the United Nations buffer zone. So the map has been like this since 1974. In 2003, there were borders, checkpoints that started to be open. So you can now move from one side to the other. But from 74 to 2003, this was shut. You could not go. The Turkish army would say no, the United Nations would say no, and the Greek Cypriots would say no. So you had 3 armies saying no to you. So nobody crossed this boundary. We have a British army base here. As you can see from the map, it is quite close to Lebanon. You can see Syria from one of the tall mountains in Cyprus. You can just about see one of the mountains in Syria. You can see Turkey most of the spring, depends on visibility. The nearest point in Greece is about 200 miles away. T.F. Creighton's own pictures. This is the town nearest to where I lived, and this is where I lived. Again, I think it's useful for you to see what the country looks like before we talk about wars and conflicts and so on. The secessionists are Turkish Cypriots. They want independence from the Greek Cypriots. The people who intervened were mainland Turkey, the Republic of Turkey, and nobody else. So before we were talking about a NATO alliance, now we're talking about one NATO country by itself. Turkish Cypriots and the Greek Cypriots. The Turkish Cypriots speak Turkish. The Greek Cypriots speak Greek. They have different languages. They're not related languages. They have different alphabets. They have different religions. They have different political cultures. They have different history which they teach in schools. They have never been to the same schools unless they were run by the British, in which case they were run totally along British lines. They have not shared a great deal together throughout their 500-year history of coexistence, except when bigger powers forced them to. Cyprus was part of pretty well every empire in the region. It was part of the Roman Empire, the Egyptian Empire, it was part of the Lusinian Empire, which was the French Empire, it was part of the Venetian Empire, part of the British Empire, but governed itself for the first time in 1960. So for the first time in 1960, they got independence and governed themselves. Within 3 years, a civil war had started. The civil war started in 1963 and carried on from 1974. An 11-year civil war, which had the Turks and the Greeks been equally matched, would not have lasted this long. The Turks are outnumbered by the Greeks by 1 to 4 or 1 to 5. There are 5 times or 4 times as many Greeks as there are Turkish Cypriots. The reason this war was able to carry on for so long is because there was a Greek Cypriot civil war at the same time. So we had a Greek Cypriot civil war and a civil war between the Greek Cypriots and the Turks. But I'm going to talk about the 30 Hot Days. This is the title of a book which I would very much recommend to you. 30 Hot Days began on the 15th of July 1974 when the Greek Cypriot civil war ended. The Greek Cypriot civil war ended as Nikos Samson, leader of one of the parties, took over the Greek Cypriot government. He was the most extreme of the Greek Cypriots. So the most extreme Greek Cypriot took over the entire apparatus of the Greek Cypriot state. He wished, fairly simply, to destroy the Turkish Cypriots. So Turkish villages were rounded up and men, women and children started to be killed en masse. There was certainly a plan to kill every Turkish Cypriot, or at least make it impossible for them to stay in Cyprus. His actions from the 15th of July until the 20th demonstrate a very strong intention to do this, and there's a lot of documentation to support this. A man named Gibbons has written a book called The Genocide Files, and again, it's very clearly spelled out. But this was interrupted on the 20th of July by the Turkish army. The Turkish army was not willing to see a genocide on its southern border. They invaded, and completing the 30 hot day cycle, on the 14th of July, the war ended. The Turkish army has a Turkish soldier for every man, woman and child in Cyprus. So there's one soldier for everyone in Cyprus. So the war was very, very short. There's no way the Greeks could survive it. And it led to the creation of the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. This is a state which is recognised by one country. So we've had Kosovo recognised by over 100. The RNC is recognised by one. It's Turkey. Nobody else. So again, we have a short intervention and a long commitment. 30 days has led to somewhere between 15,000 and 30,000 troops remaining in Cyprus. These numbers are probably a bit high now. Since 2003, the numbers have slowly started to be reduced, and Turkish troops are needed on the border with Iraq and Syria. So it might be as low as 7,000, but they are still there, and the military bases are kind of noticeable. If you believe a country is sovereign in its entirety, that should never be interfered with, then you would recognise the Republic of Cyprus. And 192 countries in the UN have recognised only the Republic of Cyprus in the south. But the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus is a democracy, described by the Council of Europe as a model democracy. The Council of Europe states they are the model for how others should be in terms of democracy. So if you believe what the people wish is important, then you would recognise the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. This seems less important to some governments. So we have again, military force did not solve the political issue. I'm willing to just stop here again and say, are there any questions?
I have a question, yes. Is it that the Turks and the Greeks want Cyprus to be part of Turkey or Greece? In other words, are we wanting to end up with two countries, Turkish Northern Cyprus and Cyprus, one country, the Republic of Cyprus, or effectively no Cyprus, where Cyprus is divided up into two countries?
That goes into the kind of the history of the Civil War. So the Greeks in the 1950s wanted Cyprus to be part of Greece. And that was a very, very strong desire. It had a word, aenosis. The leader of the aenosis movement was a man named Archbishop Makarios. And he got Cyprus to have independence. And the idea at the time was that Cyprus would get independence, then they would have a referendum and join Greece. What many commentators would notice is that when Makarios became internationally recognised as president of Cyprus, he rather enjoyed it and started to say, becoming a minor official in Greece is not what I want. He started to believe that Cyprus should remain independent, so there was a change in that policy. This change, again, could have been an internal thing. He could have enjoyed being an internationally recognised president and being invited to all the major conferences. It might also be in reaction to what was happening in Greece. Greece had a civil war, and a series of 5 colonels took over and formed a military junta. So Greece was not a nice place to live. So for a democratic, fairly advanced country like Cyprus to join with Greece, which at the time was not politically advanced at all, would not seem logical. And the coup that took place in 1974 was sponsored by the 5 colonels in Greece. The failure of that coup is what's led to the creation of the modern Greek democracy. So Greece became democratic in 1975 as the colonels could not sustain this. If you are a military government and you cannot engineer a successful military operation abroad, then that destroys your legitimacy. So just as the Argentinian junta was destroyed by the failure in the Falkland Islands, the Greek junta was destroyed by the failure in Cyprus. The Turks, for the most part, have refused to accept Turkish Cyprus as part of Turkey. They've generally wanted it to be an independent state. The very first move, when the Turkish army went in, was to designate it the Turkish Federated State of Cyprus. So from 75 onwards, Turkish Cyprus was the Turkish Federated State, and the idea was that you had one federated state in the north, federated state in the south, and it was simply locked together. This failed. But for 10 years they tried negotiations to do this. So it was only in 1984 that they had the referendum in 85 that they became the independent country they are now. Full answer, but are there any other questions for Cyprus? I did promise time for questions, so I'm going to breeze through South Ossetia and give you some conclusions. So we had the conclusion that small conflicts can rapidly escalate. The Cyprus War was not an important war for most people. The Cyprus conflict was ignored day to day until suddenly there was a military coup and it turned into a major war. The short interventions, whether it's 30 days or whether it's 78 days, leads to long commitments. So a 30-year troop presence in Cyprus, sort of 10, 15-year UN missions and EU missions to Kosovo. Tensions exist between the principles of sovereignty and self-determination. This is the more theoretical one, and perhaps the harder one. Either countries are complete, and they should get recognition country to country, or they should get recognition based on the support that these governments have. Conflicts revolve around legitimacy. Who is legitimate? What is a country? How far can you go with self-determination? And military interventions have failed to resolve the political disputes in all these countries, but can possibly save lives. As I mentioned, in the case of Cyprus, the genocide was being enacted. Villages were being killed en masse, and the military intervention did stop that. If there was no Turkish invasion of Cyprus, then there would be no Turkish Cypriots today. We might have survivors living in Turkey, or indeed in the UK and Australia, which is where the diaspora of Cyprus now live. But there wouldn't be a Turkish Cypriot community in Turkish Cyprus. So that country wouldn't exist. In the case of Kosovo, again, we might have a scattering of communities in neighbouring countries, but the Kosovans would have been killed en masse. So the invasion there did save lives in terms of Kosovo exists because we had that war. So we killed some people to save other people. But it's not the same numbers, and it's not the same makeup of numbers. It's the story that goes on behind. Okay?
Do you think military intervention is the solution to these ideas?
Certainly not in every case, and even the people who strongly argue for intervention in many cases would say not in every case. In this case, I very much have the strong kind of proviso that it can save lives, not that it will, but that it can in some cases, but that it will not solve the political problem. People will still think what people will think, and that won't change. So a political problem must be solved politically, essentially.
Because we've seen lots of powerful countries nowadays, they intervene just in countries because of their interests, not because there is a problem with this country.
Absolutely. And what we're seeing here is largely a match between when the larger power's interest matches the interest of the cessationists. So that's the three sort of examples that I gave here. It happens to be a match. It's not a match in every case. The majority of cases is where it doesn't match. So in Nigeria, for example, there was a region called Biafra. Biafra wanted to get independence, but that didn't match anybody's interests. And so that secession failed. Until South Sudan, there was only one example of a successful secessionist country, and that was Bangladesh. Bangladesh was part of Pakistan. It was called East Pakistan. But it gained independence from Pakistan. But again, that was with India's help. And that was because the Indian national interest matched the Bangladeshi interest. Otherwise, this wouldn't happen. Are there any other questions? I set aside sort of 15 minutes for them. If there are no other questions, then I'll go through the South Ossetia example. And I see that filling you with joy. My first question is, have you ever heard of this country? One yes, two yeses, three yeses. Yes, okay. So here we have Georgia. South Ossetia is slightly different from Kosovo, and it's slightly different from Cyprus, because Kosovo was definitely part of Serbia. Turkey-Cyprus was definitely part of Cyprus. South Ossetia is not definitely part of Georgia. In fact, in its history, it has never, ever been governed from Tbilisi, the capital of Georgia. Georgia was part of the Soviet Union, and South Ossetia was at one time within the administrative border, and this is the old USSR administrative border, a border drawn by Stalin. Stalin came from which country? There we go. He came from Georgia, and there was a certain element whereby I don't come from this little country, I come from a slightly bigger country, which includes all of this. The borders were changed in the Soviet Union to make Georgia seem slightly bigger, slightly more respectable for a place where a dictator could come from. But South Ossetia largely wasn't considered part of Georgia. The people are not Georgians. And when Georgia got independence from the USSR, South Ossetia broke away at pretty well the same time. So South Ossetia started governing itself. And this is what it looks like. And this is an interesting one as we start to see, this is the Caucasus Mountains. We have a whole series of mountains here. And mountains tend to generate smaller countries. If you're in a valley, then you tend to think of yourself as isolated from the people in that valley. If you're on a big open plain, then it's a bit more questionable. But they are geographically separated. So we have the Ossetians, we have the Georgians, we have the Russians. These are the three people who matter in this conflict. And again, we have a long-running conflict. 1991, the president of Georgia said that the Ossetians must be driven from our country with a red-hot iron. Friendly words? Not friendly words. This president of Georgia was deposed very rapidly and replaced with people who were comparatively moderate. They were moderate compared to wanting to burn them out with a red-hot iron. We had a series of wars which required the presence of Russian peacekeepers. Ossetians could only get passports from the Georgians if they recognized South Ossetia as part of Georgia. But since they were living within their own country, they didn't want to recognize another country as the rightful rulers of their country, so they simply refused to do it. This meant that the Ossetians, many of them, became prisoners in their own country. They could not leave because they had no passports, and their Ossetian passports were not recognized. So the Russian government started to issue them with passports. So these are Russian passport holders, but only because their own passports are not recognized, and they do not wish the Georgian passports. The passport issue became very big because the Georgians were saying the only reason the Russians give them passports is because the Russians want to invade Georgia. So the Georgians will say this is an excuse. The Russians will say that they are helping the South Ossetians. And the South Ossetians don't have much of a voice. We have the 5-day war in 2008. Do you remember the Beijing Olympics? So during the Beijing Olympics, we had the 5-day war between Russia and Georgia. They happened at the same time. And here's an interesting fact. South Ossetia, after this conflict, was recognized by Russia, Belarus, and Nicaragua. Where is Belarus? Do we know? It's in Europe. It is very much Russia's satellite. Their policy is determined by their policy. What they do, they will copy. There has never been an instance of difference. Why Nicaragua recognises South Ossetia is quite a big question. And I've only come across one theory of why the Nicaraguans recognised communism, and because the Americans told them not to. So this is a popular theory, but I've never seen evidence of it. So a 5-day war which led to South Ossetia being not recognised except by these three. So we've had Russian peacekeepers since 1991, they're still there today. And we have this question again, sovereignty or self-determination. Georgia's sovereignty or South Ossetia's rights. So again, going to your question earlier, how many peoples do we have in the world? Do we have 200 peoples? Do we have 1,000 peoples? Do we have 100,000 peoples? Or do we have just 20 as we started out with? So Georgia holds state-to-state recognition. No country in Eastern Europe is going to recognise South Ossetia. If they do that, that invites Russia to invade them. If Ukraine said, yes, Russia can go into South Ossetia, then that would be saying, well, why not into Ukraine? And that's largely the basis on which countries refuse to recognise this kind of thing. I said there were two major differences between South Ossetia, Kosovo, and Cyprus. In Kosovo, was there a genocide? Were there mass killings? Yes. Again, in Cyprus, there were mass killings. There was an attempt at genocide. In South Ossetia, well, we had the words, burn them out with a red hot iron 20 years ago, but it didn't happen then, it hasn't happened now. The Russian representative at the United Nations Security Council said, well, how many people need to die before you have a genocide? So, what is the number? And again, like a people, genocide is not a defined term. There is no definition of genocide. Is it a number? Is it a proportion? There isn't an answer to this. In the case of South Ossetia, there was a war, there were civilian casualties, but the Georgians took war in a media war as well, in a media campaign, and the Russians had a media campaign as well. So there's a lot of information out there. If you look at Western sources, they tend to favour the Georgians. They were addressing the Western media. The Russians were addressing the Russian population. So the 5-day war had an 80% approval rating in Russia and a 0 approval rating anywhere else. But 80% of the Russian people thought this 5-day war was a great idea. Again, it's a matter of what information was being put where. The Russians were not interested in a Western media campaign. They weren't interested in convincing the West they were doing the right thing. So we just have this one argument of the UN Security Council, how many do you need before it's a genocide? Evidence of a genocide here has yet to surface. So it was never governed by Georgia, but there also wasn't a genocide. So we have these two differences between this and the others. It comes into the others because Vladimir Putin said, we're going to use the Cyprus solution in this case, we're going to use the Kosovo solution in this case. So he was the man who said, well, this is the same as the other two. I'm going to use these two as an example of what I would do. Yeah. Are there any questions on this? The difference between... The difference?
Yeah.
I was mainly looking here at the similarities. The difference, there are a number of them. Kosovo is different because Kosovo was seen internationally as a big issue. So the North Atlantic Treaty Alliance, we had a whole range of countries involved, and there was not strong opposition. It was largely seen as legitimate, and has led to widespread recognition of Kosovo. Cyprus was one country, and South Ossetia was one country. Again, as I mentioned, there was a genocide in Kosovo and Turkey-Cyprus. There was no genocide in South Ossetia. Okay.
So I have a question.
Yep.
So you mentioned about the military intervention never solved the political issues.
Yeah.
But I strongly believe the military intervention or the military force is necessary to recover from the conflict or make the situation stable. But what do you think about, can I ask your opinion about the military forces, military intervention?
What is military intervention?
Your opinion about the military intervention, because you mentioned that it never solved the
It hasn't solved the political problem, it has sometimes frozen it. So we had a political problem beforehand, the military intervention was made, and it keeps a lid on it. This is what Paul Rogers would talk about lidism. That's when we have a boiling pot, we are determined to put the lid on, but we don't turn down the heat. So I'd say military intervention has successfully put a lid on. Nobody has died in the Cyprus conflict since 1974. There have been no deaths. Beforehand, there had been a 12-year civil war. Similar things could be said about Kosovo. For years, people have died in the conflict. Since then, people have not died, except for some revenge killings which did occur afterwards. The peacekeepers tried to halt it. So we have had a reduction in the conflict, but I would argue this is the lid being put on it. We have peace through superior firepower. Nobody in Serbia wants to fight NATO. The Cypriots cannot fight Turkey and win. So the lid has been kept on, but the heat has not been turned down. People will still think what they think. They'll still argue what they argue.
So do you mean the political stability or the international friendly relation is the only basis to solve this problem?
Well, one of the reasons Cyprus became such a hot issue is because the coup in Cyprus was launched by the government in Athens. The action to stop the genocide was taken from Istanbul. Greece and Turkey are both part of NATO. And there was a very great risk of a war within NATO at a time when there was very little leadership. This happened to coincide, 19th of July 1974, is a date that a lot of Americans would remember, as the date that Richard Nixon stated that he was stepping down as President of the United States as a result of the Watergate scandal. So the United States was left without strong leadership. NATO needs the United States as a leader. And so we have this potential of a war within NATO at a time when the United States was not providing strong leadership. And an example of how serious this is that this is Turkey's only major war since the Korean War. We have the Korean War, the Cypriot War, and that's it for Turkey. And their number one fighter group, the Turkish Red Stars, were not deployed in Cyprus for this war. They were deployed on the border with Greece. It was believed the threat from action from mainland Greece was so strong that key units were left on the border with Greece and were never used. So again, the stability within the global system was a major part of why this was not seen as a legitimate conflict. It led to an arms embargo from the United States on Turkey for 1 year. And again, this is a key NATO ally. Turkey is the second largest army in the NATO alliance and has been a member since its foundation. So yes, stability is seems key. Yep.
Are the European countries don't have the same view about Kosovo or about some countries, especially the smallest country? Maybe in other cases they have the same view, and there is some biggest countries have forced other countries. But about Kosovo, they don't have the same view.
Yeah. The reason they don't have the same view as Kosovo is the same reason they have a different view for Cyprus, because Greek Cyprus is now a member of the European Union. They were told, the Greek Cypriots were told by the EU, if you solve your problem, you can join the EU. And so there was a series of negotiations going on from 2003 with the head of the United Nations, Kofi Annan, coming to Cyprus and negotiating between the different parties in Cyprus. The Cypriots were told, if you agree on this, you can join the EU as one country. What happened is that Annan came to his Annan plan. You can Google it and see the full details. Both the North and the South had simultaneous referendums. Everyone in Greek Cyprus voted on whether to accept. Everyone in Turkish Cyprus voted on whether to accept. From the North, they had a powerful evet, a yes vote, by an overwhelming margin. In the South, they were given an oki, no in Greek, an overwhelming margin of no to what the head of the United Nations said was a fair plan for Cyprus. But because Greek Cyprus has the prior recognition, they were admitted into the EU as the government of the whole of Cyprus. So now there is a problem that we can't force a solution in Cyprus. We can't put pressure on Greek Cyprus to say you must come to an agreement with Turkish Cyprus, because the Greek Cypriots are now in the EU and the Turkish Cypriots are not. EU money is being spent in Turkish Cyprus to try and bring up their economic standard to a similar standard of Greek Cyprus. this money was originally halted because the original idea from the EU is that this money must go via Greek Cyprus, and they refused to pass it on. It is now going to the Turkish Cypriot authorities, and projects have gone ahead in Turkish Cyprus with EU money. Okay. Are there any other questions? No. Okay. If there are no other questions, then I'll say this is the end. If you want to stay and discuss this, you can stay and discuss this with me. If you do not, then it's time to go. Thank you.